Hello and welcome back to Drilled. I'm Amy Westervelt. We're currently running a series on false solutions, these kind of almost new climate problems that the fossil fuel industry is pawning off as climate solutions in some way. Last week, we talked about the role that management consultancies play in formulating and pushing and amplifying and lending credibility to those quote-unquote solutions. Today, I have Andy Rowell joining me to talk about a story that he and I worked on about a front group of North American natural gas producers who've been involved in creating the idea that liquefied natural gas, a fossil fuel, is a green energy solution. Pushing that idea has been really important to getting export terminals built in the US, but also to lobbying European politicians to build out more import infrastructure there. When we first started looking into this, there was a name that popped out at me because we had been doing some reporting in Pennsylvania on gas a few years back, and there was one person that several people talked to us about.
Loud drilling recommenced on December 9th, 2013. The next day, my dad called Toby Rice, and Toby said he'd get him a hotel room. So they go to the hotel room to check in. No hotel room for us.
It's just, they do what they want to do when they want to do it, how they want to do it. And Toby's making big money.
And Toby Rice himself has said to more than one person, well, just move, the first year's the worst. We'll put you up in a hotel for a year.
It was in the springtime. Toby Rice flies over here in his helicopter. He don't have no tail numbers.
I'm not going to be a doormat never again, especially for Toby Rice. I hope you sleep well, Toby.
Toby Rice is the CEO of a company called EQT. They were an early fracking company. They're now one of the largest liquefied natural gas producers in North America. They also recently purchased the controversial Mountain Valley Pipeline project, so they are in charge of that now as well. And Toby Rice kind of positions himself as like this young, upstart, everyman who just happens to be an oil CEO. He's really into the idea that like he's a millennial. He's an elder millennial. He calls himself a shale-lennial. And he's kind of always looking for the thing that's going to finally make gas a lucrative, sustainable business. Because don't forget, the fracking guys like Toby Rice, have been on a permanent boom and bust cycle for 20 plus years. They have never found something that's really made the industry work for extended periods of time. And they're kind of hoping this LNG boom is going to be it. Rice and EQT have been leading forces behind this front group that we're going to talk about in this episode, and lots of other initiatives to lobby both the US government and European governments to embrace liquefied natural gas as a climate solution. He's also been a big driver behind the idea of what the industry calls certified gas or differentiated gas. This idea that you can reduce the methane emissions and CO2 emissions associated with gas that's produced in the US, and then use that to market it as sort of a more environmentally friendly option. The problem with that, of course, is the monitoring and auditing of these improvements, which has left a lot to be desired. We're going to get into all of that and more with journalist Andy Rowell coming up after this quick break.
USAA knows dynamic duos can save the day, like superheroes and sidekicks, or auto and home insurance. With USAA, you can bundle your auto and home and save up to 10%. Visit USAA.com/bundle.
Bundle savings are off total premium, not available in all states or in all situations. To qualify, auto policy must be active prior to property policy issue, subject to change. Restrictions apply. Membership eligibility and product restrictions apply and are subject to change. USAA means United Services Automobile Association and its affiliates, San Antonio, Texas.
My name's Andy Rowell. I'm a journalist and writer, and I'm a contributing editor at Oil Change International. And I've been working and on the fossil fuel industry and oil and climate since the early 90s. So for quite a long time now.
Awesome. What made you first start tuning into Page? What Google alert did you have set up that tipped you off to Page initially?
It's suddenly, we've been looking at, or Oil Change have been looking at a sort of gas certification and the sort of greenwashing of the US LNG and gas industry. And then suddenly, and of course, Toby Rice and EQT, they're the largest producer of natural gas in the US. I think if you made EQT a country, they'd be the 12th largest gas producing nation. So they're a big player. And suddenly, we are sort of looking a bit at Toby Rice and what he's up to, because he's very vocal on this issue. And then sort of looked and think, hang on a minute, there's a new sort of organization that's popped up out of nowhere, and called Page, the Partnership to Address Global Emissions. And so started sort of trying to track what they were saying, what they were doing, and sort of, the more we looked, the more concerned you got. And it's pretty obvious. And Page is, for anyone who's sort of looked at sort of, the oil industry, as you well know, and its front groups and its messaging and its greenwashing, Page immediately was like, there was red flag after red flag after red flag.
Yeah, they kind of have all of the markers, starting with the name that sounds vaguely climate friendly,
Yeah.
It seems to me like they are, Page is predominantly there to focus on LNG exports from the US. That's their key focus, versus some of the other front groups that EQT is involved with. It's solely focused on permitting reform or things like that. This really seems to be export, and particularly also lobbying the countries that U.S. producers would be exporting to. So not just the U.S. politicians. Do you think that's an accurate assessment?
No, I think that's totally accurate. It's obvious that they've been targeting Europe, and they've been. Rice has been over here, and so has Christina, who works with him, and also recently we've been aware that they've also been targeting Asia. So, it is obvious if you're working on LNG, then Europe and Asia are the two key markets you're going to target. So it very much looks like Page is basically a front group, or whatever you want to call it, for EQT and the LNG industry to try and lobby to get exports, to greenwash gas, to tie Europe and potentially Asia into long-term contracts, for decades to come. Even though the science is saying that we can't be carrying on extracting more fossil fuels, if we want a livable climate.
I find Toby Rice very interesting, because we did some reporting a year or two ago on Pennsylvania and talked to a bunch of people in one of the areas that EQT has really dominated there. And they had all these wild stories about him, showing up at town halls. And he kind of has styled himself as this everyman, he's just a roughneck who's made it, kind of, and the image of him meeting with high level European officials is somewhat amusing to me, because this persona that he has doesn't really seem at ease in that kind of setting. But it's I don't know what you think about him as a character.
He looks, or he comes, or he's trying to portray an image that he's the kind of guy you could go and have a couple of beers with and watch baseball with, and he just happens to be one of the largest producer of natural gas in the US.
I saw that. It was really good.
So I mean, it's interesting you're saying Pennsylvania and looking into what EQT were up to there. I mean, there was a recent investigation by Public Source. I don't know if you saw it, came out. And again, it just blows away sort of the greenwash, or another layer of the greenwashing of Page, saying that, this stuff is, the greenest, whatever he's calling it, the greenest natural gas or zero carbon. He can export zero carbon, green gas to Europe. And actually the reality for folks on the ground, these could be the guys having a beer with him, is that like they can't even open their taps without methane coming out, or their water is polluted with arsenic or barium, or so there's serious problems with fracking on the ground, as well as which we often sort of forget about if we're talking about sort of the climatic impact of this industry.
Yeah, we're gonna get into that a little bit in this podcast episode and share some of that tape, because we never ended up making that season, but I have a mountain of tape from people in Pennsylvania, and a number of people. He was the only person that I heard multiple different people kind of mention, and one of the things that we heard repeated over and over again really was that he would sort of show up and because he seems to really want the local people to like him, like he wants to be accepted by the local community. And so he would show up and he would be like, if you have any problems, because people were complaining not only of the water being contaminated, but the realities of a shale drilling operation happening, right next to your house are pretty bleak. It's like an ongoing earthquake. There's really bright lights all the time. And so people were like, I can't sleep. My pets are being disturbed, all this stuff. And he would offer to put people up in hotels. And then they would show up at the hotel and there would be no reservation and they couldn't get a hold of him. And this was like, it was sort of like just a recurrent theme in the people that we talked to, which I find it interesting when people are doing sort of small things like that feel very attached to the larger things that they're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting in the sense because, if you look at, quite often when you look at some of the big players, or let's say the traditional companies that we think of when we're investigating oil and gas, like the Exxons, the Shells, the BPs, the Chevrons, you wouldn't expect like the CEO of like Mike Wirth from Exxon to sort of rock out of a town hall meeting to sort of try and justify his operations. So in that way, like Rice is different, and as his persona, he's trying to, as we've just talked about, he's trying to be like this kind of man of the people,
accessible guy,
and all that. But actually, the trouble is the reality just doesn't stack up, for what he's saying.
Yeah. He might have good intentions, but it doesn't end up panning out. You mentioned Exxon and Chevron, and I wanted to ask you about them because I also find it really interesting how you're seeing, and you kind of have always seen this in the gas industry in the US, at least, this divide between the sort of like rough and ready shale guys and the oil majors. And it's interesting that you see it in these lobbying groups as well. Like there's, you almost never see like an Exxon and a Chevron in the same lobbying group as EQT or whatever. And we got some kind of late breaking documents from the folks at Friends of the Earth who had sued the State Department to get a hold of Amos Hochstein's calendar, who was an energy advisor to Biden and a longtime gas guy. And he had all these meetings with Toby Rice at EQT, the focus of which was, to push the idea of like, certified low carbon gas or differentiated gas, this whole boondoggle that you've been looking into. And he says in like the lobbyist who's setting up the appointment for him says in a few different emails, like, basically like, we're like differentiating ourselves in the industry, and I'm sure it's not going to go over well, but we need to do it, and all of this stuff. Like they're going to outpace Exxon and Chevron by doing more environmentally friendly gas, and they're going to spur everybody else in the industry on and all that kind of stuff. But I'm curious what you think about just how the oil majors and these guys operate kind of separate from each other in parallel streams.
I think that's a really interesting point. Traditionally, sort of, if you go back to some of the sort of front groups that the oil industry was involved in, like the GCC or I think they were called the Climate Council as well in the 90s. Those were the oil majors. You wouldn't have had any of these kind of like fracking players in any of those organizations. I mean, they'll all sit under the umbrella of, say, the American Petroleum Institute, which is
Right.
a broad church of the biggest lobbying group often in the US, pushing sort of the oil industry's interests. But in this specific instance, often you see the sort of the small. Well, I mean, EQT is like,
it's hard to think of them as like the little guy, but
they're like they're like the shark in the small pond, aren't they? They're increasingly, they are the largest gas producer in the US. So I mean, they're a big player now, but they're still probably not in the same room often as an Exxon, as a Shell, or as a BP.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting too, because there was this moment around the pandemic where you could kind of see how groups like API, for example, at a certain point might be lobbying like in the interests of a Chevron and an Exxon and against the interests of like an EQT or a Pioneer. There was a moment where within the API, Chevron and Exxon were lobbying like against getting more federal bailout money for the shale drillers. And it was pretty clear that it was like their goal was to just snap up some of those guys, which they did,
Which is what you do, which is the playbook, is,
That's what you do. Yeah.
And if you've got as much cash sitting in the bank as Exxon, then, when a minnow gets too big and it's strategic, you just swallow it up.
Yeah, exactly. And you're seeing that. I mean, with the Pioneer acquisition, Chevron's attempt to get Hess. There's and you see too that in a lot of the chatter around the oil majors is kind of focused on we need to sort of buy up more resources to continue posting growth numbers and all that kind of thing. It's like at a certain point, they're running out of new reserves to tap, and they have to just buy up the ones that exist already.
And doubling down on oil and gas.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I want to have you talk a little bit about the certified gas stuff and just how little there is. What are people actually measuring when they're claiming to have sort of environmentally preferable gas?
Can I just take one step back? I think what you're seeing with certified gas is in late 2020, the French government, which is, they've got I think it's a 33% interest in LNG. And LNG was just about to do a 20-year, $7 billion LNG project with Rio Grande by next decade. And the French government basically pulled the plug, and they said, actually, we think we don't want you to import US gas because it's too dirty. It's got too much of a methane problem.
Interesting.
And this sends huge shockwaves through the US, gas industry. And so since then, there's been this systematic campaign to greenwash US gas as green, and the certification is part of that. So what they're saying is you can have, this is what they're claiming, is you can basically have green gas, you can have net zero gas or carbon neutral gas. And the way they're going to do it is they're going to certify, put monitors on across, the upstream and midstream industry and check for leaks in real time, and then stop the leakage of methane. And if you can stop, their argument is if you can stop the leakage of methane, and methane is, of course, a much more potent, greenhouse gas. It's like 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And if you can plug the methane leaks and then you can offset the carbon emissions at the end, then you could supposedly have, zero carbon. And you had a sort of a number of companies, of which, say, Project Canary is one, that basically sort of sprung up, seeing a market opportunity and said, hey, we're independent and we will verify this gas as responsibly sourced or differentiated. There's a number of different words that are used. And so Oil Change and Earthworks, began looking again at what was going on. Earthworks went out in the field and they stuck their cameras in front of quite a few sites and basically showed the complete discrepancy between the rhetoric of what a company like Project Canary was saying and EQT and all these others are saying that, hey, this is great, we've got certified gas, and the reality, and the report that one came out last year and another one's just come out this month. Last year's report showed over 7 months, basically, they failed to capture every significant pollution event. And most of the time, there were problems with the monitors. Often the monitors are placed outside, buffer walls or, in places where they, upstream where the wind is going downstream. So they know that the pollution will never be caught.
Wow.
And then this year's report basically showing regularly of missing pollution events. Project Canary's monitors, which supposedly continuously monitor for pollution events and methane leakage, were offline for 25% of the time. So a quarter of the time they're offline. And even if there's a problem, companies are really taking action. So, so there's serious questions to answer about the sort of the claims that the industry and companies like Project Canary are making as to certified gas, and how robust it is, and how it is actually really reducing methane emissions.
Didn't Project Canary do like a lot of pilot studies with EQT to like develop their whole thing too?
They were doing pilot studies with EQT and others, yes. And the sort of what we were hearing on the street is a lot of their sort of pilot projects never sort of moved into sort of full-blown fruition with a number of customers.
That's interesting because I know in those emails where they were requesting meetings with U.S. officials, one of the things that they were using was this claim that EQT's gas is has 1/10 the methane of other U.S. producers. Which I was like, where's that stat coming from? Interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And if your monitor's not picking up your pollution and there's not enough monitors and they're all in the wrong place and they're offline, all these kind of things, it just shows that there's a stack of problems. And I think there were other sorts of significant issues. I mean, for example, like Chris Romer, who was, then the sort of CEO of Project Canary, he was talking about certifying gas as a way of fixing the gas industry's brand problem. They would be claiming to be independent, but actually saying, hey guys, through certifying gas, we will fix your image and allow you to sell, so-called responsibly sourced gas to the Europeans, to the Asians, and those who are worried about climate change. And that's where it gets really sort of dangerous, say, from a European perspective, because you've got the Europeans now saying, actually, we need, or, talking to people like Toby Rice about importing LNG. And if there is a veneer of green over that gas through certification, it allows them to go to the European, consumers and say, actually, it's okay. We can have European climate goals via, American LNG because American LNG is green.
Yeah.
But again, that is completely and utterly disingenuous because there are fundamental flaws with LNG and also the certification process.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I know that one of the things that all of the gas producers have been trying to do is increase the length of time that these contracts with Europe will last. And the European Union did put in place contract limits, but they also added this little, amazing caveat for the industry, which around, the word unabated, which they put in, contracts for unabated gas cannot last beyond 2049. So I wonder if that has also driven some, increased interest in certification and, just generally trying to make it seem like producers are quote unquote abating those emissions in some way.
Yeah. I mean, I think about 40%, or the industry claims about 40% of US gas is now certified.
Wow.
So, that's been a significant change over the last 2 years, a massive increase.
Yeah.
And, there is no doubt about it that the industry sees certification as a sort of key tenet of getting long-term LNG contracts with European buyers.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go back to what happened in late 2020 and the fact that the French government got LNG to pull out because of concerns about how dirty LNG was, it shows that this is, the industry strategy to get around or to overcome those concerns and convince the Europeans that they can have their cake and eat it, which is they supposedly have got quite, bold climate goals, but then they can still have massive imports of LNG for the next, 20 years. But again, that is completely flawed from a sort of scientific perspective. And where, we know that the methane is still leaking in the US. We know that when you're burning gas, you're still emitting carbon. And also that the UN and all the climate scientists are saying if we want a livable future, if we want to try and keep anywhere near 1.5 or even 2 degree warming, then we just cannot carry on, looking and exploring for more oil and gas. And the other thing that's sort of really interesting from a sort of public relations perspective, from the sort of the Toby Rices and others, is that gas used to be seen as a transition fuel. They were saying, okay, well, we need gas to be a transition fuel, to renewables, and that will gives us time to develop renewables. But now the sort of messaging from Rice and others is actually gas is integral to the transition, because if you clean up your methane emissions and then you offset the carbon emissions, you can have zero carbon kind of gas, which is a misnomer.
Yeah, there was even in the most recent kind of dump of documents from the U.S. government's investigation into climate disinformation, there was this strategy document that was done for BP. I think it was from Brunswick, where they talked about the need to shift from the idea of gas as a bridge to gas as the destination.
Yeah.
Which of course we all knew, but like they explicitly stated it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there you go. It's on the nail, it's in black and white. And of course it would be a PR company, that's coming up with a strategy, and I'm sure both of us could talk long and hard about, the role of the PR companies in the climate crisis. But yes, there has been a significant shift in the public relations strategy of the oil and gas industry to sort of move the dial from gas, as a bridge fuel, is to actually say, no, gas can be here to stay. It's integral to the transition, as long as we've got certification and we've got offsetting.
Yeah.
A transition away from fossil fuels has now, in their minds, become a transition,
from
a
one
clean
fossil
energy
fuel
transition.
to another.
where fossil fuels are integral to it. It's mad.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting too, because I will often hear people kind of being like, oh, well, like it's too much of a leap to go from, coal and oil to renewables or whatever. Like you need to have some kind of a transition in the middle and this, that, the other, right? But like they never talk about the transition from coal to gas as being too much of a leap, right?
Yeah.
It's like, but we're doing an energy transition. It's just not the right one. One of the things, speaking of coal, that EQT says a lot, and Page as well, and is kind of seems to be integral to their math on emissions, is this idea that LNG, that, US LNG is always replacing coal. I'm curious if you've seen that from other producers as well, like this idea that like, well, if it's replacing coal, then it's definitely going to be better, and it's always replacing coal, so that's great, we're good.
I mean, I think two things. One is, let's not forget that, some studies have shown that, LNG is actually worse for the climate than coal. So when Toby Rice says we're replacing coal, as is to suggest that this is beneficial, there's actually, that statement needs to be unpicked and verified. And I think a number of climate scientists would counter him on that. To me, Page seems to have really doubled down on that, messaging as, hey, we're going to unleash LNG, and it's, it works as a coal replacement. But actually, in reality, it's never like that. What they're doing at the moment, or they've, in response to, say, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, again, they've all been, Rice and others have been going to Brussels and Berlin to say, again, as we've just been talking about, let's lock Europe into LNG from the US. And so that's, it's not, they're not replacing coal. They're basically trying to, make a new market for US LNG.
Right. It's more often just replacing other gas than coal. And to your point, we don't even know that it's a net good to replace coal with gas either. So
but what it is doing, as you said before, is they're trying to lock Europe and other consumers into these long-term contracts, which never existed before. So in that sense, it's even worse for the climate.
Can I have you talk about that a little bit? Like the fact that they never existed before. How unusual is it for companies to get the kinds of like 20, 30, even more, year contracts that these guys are trying to lock in?
My understanding is like European and potentially sort of maybe even Russian contracts were done on a much, shorter timescale. But, the US LNG industry is basically, it's having to build the infrastructure, a lot of the infrastructure to do the exports. So the only way they can make that sort of financially viable in the long term is to lock their consumers into long-term contracts. So the US industry has been really pushing and trying to sort of get, decades-long contracts where Europe wasn't sort of used to having to do that before. And now, because of, say, the Ukraine, Russia's invasion and the Ukraine war, they've been at their sort of most energy vulnerable, and into that space, companies like EQT, people like Toby Rice have just sort of jumped and said, hey, we've got your solution. But the problem with that is we want a long-term contract.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting because I do feel like, the US, especially the EQTs of, Chesapeake and Cheniere and all of these like small, they're not small anymore, but like the upstart fracking guys. It seems to me like so much of the desire for long-term contracts is not just, of course, everybody wants to lock in, a high volume long-term contract, but those guys in particular have had really like an endless boom and bust cycle their entire existence. Yeah. It's like, they have not been able to figure out a stable business model. And I don't know, I feel like I always just kind of get that vibe from Toby Rice. Like whenever I see him on a news show or whatever, it's like, it's just sort of like a magpie going from shiny thing to shiny thing, looking for like what's gonna deliver the kind of profitability that I'm looking for. Like I just, it's like, oh, it's Europe, oh, it's Asia, oh, it's AI,
Yeah.
Yeah.
You've got to keep, you've got to produce another card out of your pack to justify, carrying on drilling, carrying on LNG expansion, carrying on building the infrastructure, when at the same time the reality on the ground is impacted communities who can't drink their water, with all the sort of health impacts, the climate impacts, the UN and all climate scientists basically saying we cannot carry on drilling for more. And the LNG industry saying, oh, yes, we can. And this is how we're going to do it.
And we're also now hearing from Europe, like, we just don't need that much. Like there are all of these reports coming out that the import build out has already outpaced the actual need for LNG in Europe. So, that's concerning too, because like what happens with a gas glut historically, more plastic and petrochemicals, So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a really fundamental point that, is actually, I think US LNG exports to the EU have tripled in the, between 2021 to 2023. But actually, demand is decreasing.
Yeah.
And
like significantly too.
Yeah.
We're talking, I think it was a 22% decrease from 2022 to 2023. That's really significant. And it's not just being replaced by renewables. It's also coming from efficiency, which is great because, I think there was just this report this past week where you see what happens when like you shift energy sources but don't reduce energy use, especially in the current context. It doesn't do much to emissions, but they're doing both, So, it's very concerning.
Yeah, and Europe, whether it already has, I mean, I think you probably could make an argument that it already has, got itself into a pickle, because if those trends continue, where you've got massive increase of US LNG and you've got you've decreasing demand and you've just locked yourself into decades-long contracts, something isn't going to make sense very quickly. You're going to end up, contractually importing gas where you have no demand.
Exactly. And then I've even seen some of the US producers kind of push this idea of like, don't worry, because then you can just sell it on to Asia. But, that's really it's not a great fix. And the US producers are also increasing their direct sales to Asia. So it's just sort of passing the buck along.
And from a climate perspective, it makes no sense to be, shipping LNG to Europe, to Asia. And, don't forget, the European Union, they've got, quite robust climate goals. And again, there's a discrepancy there between sort of the reality of how dirty LNG is and, what those goals are.
Yeah. That's it for this week. Thanks for listening. Keep an eye out for that LNG episode coming soon, as well as episodes on lots of other faulty problems masquerading as solutions from the fossil fuel industry. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.